Hello everyone, I'm Joey, and welcome back. Let me ask you something. Have you ever walked into a grocery store, picked up a carton of eggs, looked at the price, and wondered, how can eggs possibly cost this much? For decades, eggs were considered one of the most affordable foods in America, a simple breakfast staple, cheap, nutritious, available almost everywhere. Then, almost overnight, everything changed. Some stores had empty shelves, restaurants added egg surcharges, families began limiting how many eggs they bought. News headlines talked about record prices. Social media exploded with photos of cartons costing several times what people were used to paying. Many people blamed inflation. Others blamed greedy companies. Some blamed the government. Others pointed to bird flu. So, what actually happened? Was it just inflation? Was there a shortage? Or is there a much bigger story behind one of America's most important grocery items? Today, we're going to break down exactly why egg prices increased so dramatically. Why something that had been inexpensive for generations suddenly became one of the most talked about products in supermarkets, and why economists often use eggs as a perfect example of how supply and demand work in the real world. Let's begin. Eggs are different from most foods. At first glance, an egg seems like one of the simplest products you can buy. A chicken lays an egg. The egg is collected, packed, delivered, sold. Simple, right? Not exactly. The modern egg industry is one of the most efficient agricultural systems in the world. Millions of hens produce eggs every single day. Farmers carefully monitor feeding schedules, lighting, temperature, veterinary care, transportation, packaging, food safety, and distribution. Every step has a cost. If just one part of that system changes, the final price consumers pay can change too. The supply chain behind one carton of eggs. Most people only see the grocery shelf, but before those eggs arrive, a lot has already happened. Farmers purchase feed. Feed manufacturers buy corn and soybeans. Fuel is used to transport those ingredients. Electricity powers barns and refrigeration systems. Workers collect, inspect, and package the eggs. Trucks deliver them to distribution centers. Then retailers receive them and place them on store shelves. If any one of those costs increases, the final retail price can rise. But during the recent price surge, something much bigger happened. The number of egg-laying hens dropped dramatically, and that's where the real story begins. The biggest factor: bird flu. The single biggest reason egg prices rose so sharply was the outbreak of highly pathogenic avian influenza, commonly known as bird flu. This virus spreads quickly among poultry. When it is detected on a commercial farm, producers often have to cull entire flocks to prevent the disease from spreading further. That can mean hundreds of thousands, or even millions, of egg-laying hens being removed from production. Imagine a factory suddenly losing half of its machines overnight. Production would fall immediately. The same thing happens with egg farms. Fewer hens means fewer eggs. And fewer eggs entering the market means less supply available for consumers. During the worst periods of the outbreak, millions of birds were affected, significantly reducing egg production across the United States and creating sharp swings in wholesale and retail prices. Why farmers can't replace chickens overnight. Many people assume, if chickens die, just buy more chickens. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Egg-laying hens require time to hatch, grow, and mature before they begin producing eggs consistently. That process takes months. Even after farms are restocked, production doesn't immediately return to previous levels. Meanwhile, consumers continue buying eggs every day. That creates an imbalance. Demand remains relatively stable. Supply falls sharply, and prices begin rising. This is one of the clearest examples of basic economics. When supply decreases while demand remains relatively unchanged, prices usually increase. 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, 20, 40, 60, 80 demand supply quantity price. Modify demand or supply to see how equilibrium changes. Demand shift, supply shift. This simple market mechanism helps explain why egg prices can change so quickly when production is disrupted. Feed costs. Also, increased bird flu wasn't the only challenge. Feeding chickens is expensive. Corn and soybean meal are the primary ingredients in poultry feed. When those commodities become more expensive, the cost of producing eggs also rises. Weather conditions, global demand, transportation expenses, and fertilizer prices can all influence grain markets. Farmers cannot avoid these costs. Feed represents one of the largest operating expenses on an egg farm. Even if production remains stable, higher feed costs can still put upward pressure on prices. Transportation matters more than you think. Eggs are highly perishable. They must move quickly from farms to stores while remaining refrigerated. That requires trucks, fuel, drivers, warehouses, packaging, and refrigeration. If diesel prices rise, transportation becomes more expensive. If labor costs increase, distribution costs also rise. Unlike products that can sit in storage for months, eggs have a relatively short shelf life. That makes an efficient transportation network essential. Every additional cost along that journey can eventually reach consumers. Why didn't people simply buy something else? Here's something interesting. Egg demand is surprisingly resilient. People eat eggs for breakfast. Restaurants use them in countless recipes. Bakeries rely on them. Food manufacturers use them in pasta, sauces, desserts, and many processed foods. Because eggs are an ingredient in so many products, demand doesn't disappear overnight. Even when prices rise, many households continue buying them. Economists call this relatively inelastic demand. Consumers may buy slightly fewer eggs, but overall demand doesn't collapse. That combination, strong demand and reduced supply, helps explain why prices moved so dramatically. Was inflation the whole story? Many headlines simply blamed inflation. Inflation certainly increased production costs, higher wages, higher fuel prices, more expensive packaging, more expensive transportation. All of these mattered. But inflation alone doesn't explain the magnitude of the price spike. The largest shock came from the reduction in egg supply caused by bird flu, while broader cost pressures added to the overall increase. So, if bird flu explains much of the story, why did prices rise so much more than many other foods? Why did some economists argue that supply alone wasn't the complete explanation? And what role did competition, wholesale pricing, and market investigations play? If bird flu explains much of the story, why did prices rise so much more than many other foods? Why did some economists argue that supply alone wasn't the complete explanation? And what role did wholesale markets, retailers, and competition play? Let's continue. One of the biggest misconceptions is that grocery stores simply invent prices. In reality, the price you see on the shelf is influenced by several different markets. First, egg producers sell eggs into the wholesale market. Distributors purchase those eggs. Retailers then buy from distributors or directly from producers. Finally, the eggs arrive at your local supermarket. When wholesale prices increase dramatically, retail stores often pay significantly more to restock their shelves. Some retailers absorb part of those higher costs. Others pass most of the increase on to consumers. That's why prices don't always move at exactly the same speed across every grocery store. One supermarket may have signed supply contracts months earlier. Another may need to buy eggs at current market prices. The result? Different prices for what appears to be the exact same product. Another question many people asked was, if production is recovering, why aren't prices dropping immediately? The answer lies in how supply chains work. Even after farms begin replacing lost hens, those birds need time before they reach full egg production. Meanwhile, wholesalers continue adjusting inventory, retailers negotiate new contracts, transportation schedules normalize, packaging companies increase production. Everything takes time. Markets rarely return to normal overnight. Instead, prices often decline gradually as supply improves. This became one of the most debated questions. Some consumer groups argued that certain producers may have benefited from unusually high prices. Several legal cases and government investigations examined whether pricing practices in the egg industry complied with competition laws. At the same time, Major egg producers maintained that the primary reason for higher prices was the historic reduction in supply caused by bird flu and the increased costs of production. It's important to distinguish between allegations, investigations, and proven facts. Markets can experience extraordinary price increases because of genuine shortages. Governments may also investigate whether companies followed competition laws during those periods. Both things can happen at the same time. Understanding that difference is essential when evaluating economic news. Economists often use eggs as an example because almost every principle of economics appears in a single product. Supply, demand, production costs, transportation, consumer behavior, competition, government regulation, international commodity prices, labor costs, even weather. Few everyday products demonstrate so many economic forces at once. When one part of the system changes, the effects quickly spread throughout the entire supply chain. Could this happen again? The honest answer is yes. Not necessarily because of bird flu, but because food production always faces uncertainty. Extreme weather, animal diseases, transportation disruptions, energy prices, feed costs, global trade, labor shortages. Any combination of these factors can affect food prices. Agriculture has always been one of the industries most exposed to unexpected events. That's why food prices sometimes move more dramatically than people expect. You may have noticed something interesting. Some grocery prices barely changed. Others increased dramatically. Why? It depends on how easily supply can adjust. Some products can be imported from many countries. Others have long production cycles. Some foods can be stored for months. Eggs cannot. Some industries have many competing suppliers. Others are more concentrated. Each market behaves differently. That's why economists rarely talk about food prices, as if every product follows the same pattern. Each product has its own supply chain, its own risks, and its own economics, even if you never think about agricultural economics. The story of egg prices teaches several important lessons. First, low prices should never be taken for granted. Many everyday products depend on incredibly complex supply chains. Second, a shortage doesn't necessarily mean someone is deliberately creating it. Sometimes unexpected events genuinely reduce production. Third, inflation isn't always the only explanation. Individual products can experience price increases for reasons completely separate from the overall inflation rate. Finally, markets constantly adjust. High prices encourage producers to restore supply. As production recovers, prices often begin moving back toward more sustainable levels. The adjustment isn't immediate, but markets are always responding to changing conditions. Egg prices became one of the biggest economic stories in America because they affected nearly everyone. Rich or poor, young or old, almost every household buys groceries. When the price of a basic food suddenly increases, people notice immediately. That's why economists closely monitor products like eggs. They provide valuable insight into how supply chains respond to unexpected shocks. They also remind us that the economy isn't something happening only on Wall Street. It's happening every time someone shops for food, fills up a gas tank, pays rent, or buys everyday necessities. Economics isn't just about charts and stock markets, it's about daily life. So, why were eggs so expensive? Not because of one single reason. It was the result of several powerful forces happening at the same time. A major outbreak of bird flu reduced the number of egg-laying hens. Supply fell sharply. Production costs increased. Feed became more expensive. Transportation costs remained elevated. Demand stayed relatively strong because eggs are an essential food for millions of households. And as supply struggled to keep up, prices rose dramatically. The good news is that agricultural markets are dynamic. As farms rebuild their flocks and production recovers, prices can ease, although future outbreaks or other disruptions could still cause new fluctuations. Understanding the story behind egg prices helps explain something much bigger than breakfast. It shows how a single disruption in one industry can ripple through an entire economy and affect millions of consumers. The next time you see prices suddenly rise for any everyday product, you'll know there's often a much larger economic story behind that price tag. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, subscribe for more simple, fact-based explanations about economics, personal finance, and the forces shaping the world around us. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.